Hello there, Mad Mike here, and welcome back to the channel. So now we are going to continue our journey to Endgame with the second big team-up movie of the MCU, Avengers: Age of Ultron from 2015. Now, this movie brings back our returning Avengers. You have Jeremy Renner as Hawkeye, Scarlett Johansson as Black Widow, Tony, I keep saying Tony Stark, Robert Downey Jr. as Iron Man, Chris Evans as Captain America, Chris Hemsworth as Thor, Kobe Smulders as Mariah Hill, a small appearance of Sam Jackson as Nick Fury, Mark Ruffalo coming back for his second appearance as the Hulk, not counting the post-credit scene from Iron Man 3. Um, and among them, we're also getting a few new characters: Aaron Taylor Johnson as Quicksilver, Elizabeth Olsen as Scarlet Witch, and James Spader doing the voice of the main villain, Ultron. Uh, and then this film was directed by Joss Whedon. Now, the development of this film was a little weird in terms of some of the stuff because Joss Whedon, this is kind of when he started his trolley phase. You know, he was really into the MCU after the first Avengers, and then he made this, and there was a lot of weird stuff that he was saying that they were basically kind of like holding a gun to his head, almost like you have to include this in the movie and certain other things. So whether or not that was Whedon exaggerating or whether or not Whedon wanted to do something stupid is still up in the air. Although given his track record after the fact, I would assume it's the latter. Um, but regardless, the movie was made. It was released. I believe it made slightly less than the first Avengers, although it was not as well received. But this is kind of the thing. Everybody was thinking it was going to be Thanos because at the end of the first Avengers, we see Thanos. So everybody kind of thought he was going to be the main villain of the second one. They thought that was all kind of locked in. That's why they showed him. But then Ultron kind of comes out of the blue. And this was also, oddly enough, this was named. The name of the film is the same as the Age of Ultron comic series that was done by Brian Michael Bendis. That has nothing. That neither of them had anything to do with each other, other than the fact they were being put out at around the same time. But moving on from that, we go to the movie, and our opening scene is the Avengers, and they're closing in on this Hydra facility, and basically this kind of carries over from Captain America: The Winter Soldier, where now the Avengers are tasked with mopping up the remains of Hydra and trying to relocate Loki's scepter because apparently the Hydra agents were able to steal it and use it for experimentation at some point between the first Avengers and now. So in this scene, we get introduced to characters like Baron von Strucker, who is he's a character from Captain America's kind of past. In the comics, he is. They don't really do a very good job explaining him in this film. He's more or less just a Hydra scientist in this. They do make him visually kind of look similar. They give him the monocle and stuff. But basically, he's running this facility in the fictional country of Sokovia. And Sokovia is essentially it's an Eastern European bloc country, former Soviet Union, that kind of thing. I think they wanted to kind of mimic it with Victor Von Doom's country. I think it was Doomstad or something like that. I think they wanted to mirror that because it has like a castle and like stuff up on a hill, and there's a bunch of villages and stuff below it. But basically, the Avengers take on this facility, and the Quicksilver and Scarlet Witch are the results of experimentation with, I believe it is the not the Life Stone. It is the Soul Stone, which is inside of the Loki scepter. So they were able to alter them and basically give them superpowers. Now, Quicksilver, super speed. Scarlet Witch is a little bit more complicated. It's kind of like they say it's magic, but basically she can do a bunch of things. She can mess with people's minds. She can levitate objects and stuff like that. She's extremely powerful, though. So far more powerful than her brother. So in a last ditch effort, they let loose the two of them, and they wind up kind of fighting the Avengers, but kind of not. Aaron Taylor Johnson, Quicksilver gets a few hits on Hawkeye, and some stuff like that, but nothing really too solid. And then eventually we kind of build up to the end of it, where Iron Man and Captain America and all of them assault the building. Iron Man goes in, and Scarlet Witch basically shows him over the course of the battle. Scarlet Witch is able to kind of tap into everyone's minds individually, and more specifically, she taps into Tony's mind. And Tony, she makes him see his inevitable defeat, the idea that he gets all of his friends killed, and it plays on his post traumatic stress after the first Avengers, after he goes through the portal with the nuke. It plays on that idea that he's not going to be strong enough. He needs to try and do something so that they're ready for if the Chitauri come back, and Thanos and all of that. And it's messing with his head, but he doesn't know that at this point. None of the other Avengers know that either. But we digress from that point, and we go back. So now the Avengers are. Oh, and there's also a little bit of a side plot. There's this robot force that Tony Stark has created, that he refers to as the Iron Legion, which are basically just a bunch of autonomous suits of Iron Man armor that are meant to kind of help negate civilian casualties. And one of them gets acid thrown on its faceplate, and the acid melts away the metal a little bit, and it turns into kind of like a half-assed Ultron face. And it's meant to be a precursor. But we then go to one of the best character development scenes of the film, which is at the very beginning, which is the party scene. Now, they've collected the scepter. Thor's going to be going home after that, back to Asgard, and there's going to be a bunch of other stuff that's going on. This is kind of like a big hurrah, where everybody's going to kind of go their separate ways afterwards, and everybody's kind of interacting. This is where we also kind of have a buildup of certain relationships, more specifically the Black Widow Hulk relationship, where it's basically, and again, this is something that's very strange, because the relationship between her and Steve Rogers is played up more heavily in Winter Soldier, and then this sort of just comes around. Almost out of nowhere, and it's very, very odd from what I could. I shouldn't say out of nowhere. There's a bit of a hinting at it in the first Avengers, but not as much as in Captain America, Winter Soldier. And honestly, I think that they should have played that up more, because that relationship was relatively complex, and those two seem like they'd go good together, as opposed to Mark Ruffalo and Scarlett Johansson. So, go past that. Everybody's at the party, and then by the end of it, it's this big shindig. It's at Avengers Tower, and everybody, a bunch of people are there. But then, what winds up happening is, during the shindig, or at least before the shindig, and then leading into the shindig, I don't know why I keep saying shindig. The Tony Stark and Bruce Banner are busy examining what they believe to be an old Chitauri AI. And the whole idea they're having is they want to try and reboot the AI and rewrite its code and use it with the Iron Legion in order to essentially create like a peacekeeping force of Iron Man armors. Kind of like what Tony did with his house call protocol. It's kind of carrying on from that idea from Iron Man 3. And Mark Ruffalo, Bruce Banner's arguing with Tony Stark about it. He's, is it right? Should we be doing this? And then, they essentially, the party's going to go on, so they leave. They leave Jarvis, the Tony's AI, in charge of, monitoring this other new AI, and making sure he doesn't, go into other stuff before they can, finish rewriting his programming. So while the party is going on, basically Ultron has this back and forth with Jarvis, which is interesting, because it's two disembodied beings, where Ultron is far more brutal in what he decides, as opposed to Jarvis. And basically his logical conclusion is that the only way to save humanity is to basically destroy it, because humanity is unsalvageable. And his only thing that's in his way is really the Avengers. So here we kind of set up the conflict in a sense. I think that it's done a bit clunkily, but again, they set up the conflict where Ultron, the reason why he opposes the Avengers is because he believes that they're the only thing standing in his way between essentially saving the human race by destroying it, and essentially replacing them with machines. And obviously, the Avengers are opposing him because he wants to exterminate the human race. But during this process, Ultron kills Jarvis, or kills, quote unquote, even though he's a computer program, and takes control of the Iron Legion, and then proceeds to go attack the Avengers. Now, before this is actually a really, really funny scene. That's probably the best scene in the whole movie, by my account. So, we come to this point now where they're all trying to lift the hammer, and it's really hilarious of the ideas, because Tony Stark is trying to basically he's basically trying to come up with a logical reason on why the hammer can't be lifted as opposed to Thor's, which is just you're not worthy. Um, and about all the stuff, and then they do a little monologue about it at the end too, which is kind of funny. But they do a whole thing where pretty much all the Avengers try to lift it. Hawkeye tries to lift it. Iron Man and War Machine both try to lift it separately and together. Um, Bruce Banner tries to lift it unsuccessfully. And then the last one, which is probably one of the best little comic nods, is Captain America, who moves it very, very slightly, and they do this very good camera angle where you see Chris Hemsworth's face, uh, and he's looking at the hammer, and he notices it move, and you just kind of see his face go blank of like, what? It's extremely funny, but then he just goes, oh no, it's nothing, because Captain America, turns out he can't lift it. But in the comics, there is a point where I believe Captain America does lift Thor's hammer, so it's kind of a little nod to that. Um, but then we have the battle with the first of the Ultron drones, and after that, we find out that basically everything gets leaked out to the other Avengers, because the only people that knew about the Ultron project, which now he has given himself a name, which is Ultron, is that Tony Stark and Bruce Banner had done it without talking to the rest of the team. And this is also where we kind of set up the beginning of the conflict between Tony Stark and Captain America. And the beginning of that kind of rift that just gets wider and wider until we get to Civil War. But it's the idea that essentially everybody's basically saying that Tony created a murder bot. Um, but the idea that he was going with was he was trying to create something that would protect humanity. But now this thing has identified humanity as essentially a threat because humanity is imperfect. So we now have this issue where now the other Avengers are also distrusting of Tony due to this. So they basically surmise that the next step in Ultron's plan is to get himself, essentially to either try and get support, because he's leaked himself onto the internet, so he can be anywhere at once wherever he wants to be. But he needs a physical form. He needs a body, and this is how he essentially crafts his first form that we see him in the film. Before he makes himself into before he gives himself a vibranium exoskeleton. And the event, Tony Stark is basically able to figure out that there's only a few people that he could go to, and there's only one that he knows that would probably sell to him, which is Ulysses Claw, who shows up again in the Black Panther film, and we actually get to see how he loses his arm in this one. Um, but before that, Ultron gathers his support, which is the Maximoff twins, Quicksilver and Scarlet Witch. So, because now they're basically on the run, because the Shield facility, or the Hydra facility that they were in, was destroyed. So there's a nice little scene where they kind of meet him in this cathedral. He has this red cloak over himself, so they don't exactly know who he is. And then eventually he reveals himself for what he is, and explains his motives and stuff to them, and they're willing to align themselves with him because they hate the Avengers. But it's a good little scene. It's a homage to the comic books again, where Whedon does that stuff pretty well. He likes to do homages, and he does them fairly well, and he's able to adapt them to screen so they don't seem campy or stupid. Um, and that there's, but of course we have after that point, there's a few little skirmishes here and there, but for the most part, then we go to the weapons dealer, Ulysses Claw, who is, I believe, it's in South Africa, on this beach in South Africa, and so the Avengers track him there, uh, but they are not entirely successful. And this is where we have their first big face-off with the Maximoff twins, where Quicksilver gets the advantage on a few of them, where he's able to he beats up Captain America pretty good, and Scarlet Witch comes in, and so on and so forth. But we essentially have this point where it's actually a really good line where it shows kind of what the what Ultron's attitude is, because he's talking to Ulysses Claw, and he makes this statement, make your friends rich, make your enemies richer. And Ulysses Claw points at him and says, Tony Stark always used to say that. And Ultron takes great offense to this because he believes he basically his object of hatred is Tony Stark. So he takes great offense to this and then proceeds to accidentally rip off Ulysses Claw's arm, which he then later on replaced with a laser rifle. But it's kind of it establishes that kind of motive that you have with Ultron, where he just, even though he's a machine, he has these illogical urges. He's come to the logical conclusion, but at the same time, he has these emotions that are almost imprinted on him from Tony Stark, which is very, very interesting, just from a character perspective. And also, there's a very interesting point. It's kind of like where he says, it's a line from Pinocchio, that there's no strings on me. And it was a line that was used in the trailer, and they used it a couple of times in the film. But it goes kind of along those lines of like the Hal from 2001, where he's saying Daisy, Daisy, how does your garden grow? It's the same kind of idea. It's very, very disturbing, I guess, when you hear it put in that kind of a tone and in that kind of a voice. But it's very interesting. Um, so we have the battle between really it's Iron Man, Thor, and Cap for the most part versus Ultron, Quicksilver, and Scarlet Witch. So Ultron's not stupid, and that's kind of what the fight in South Africa proves, is that he knew the Avengers were probably going to be there, and the whole point was he was trying to get vibranium from Claw, um, so that he could make his new body, and now that, and also so he could make some other devices that will come into play later. So he essentially, um, he uses Wanda to manipulate the Bruce Banner into turning into the Hulk and going on a rampage. And basically, this kind of takes away from everything else the Avengers are doing now. So because they have to stop the Hulk, otherwise he could kill hundreds of thousands of people. And this is when we get one of the biggest, best scenes in the movie, is when Tony Stark dons the Hulkbuster armor for the first time. And I remember people were saying in Iron Man 3, oh, there's the big suit of armor that he has come in. Oh, that's got to be the Hulkbuster armor. Nope, the Hulkbuster armor is way bigger than that. And it's like a modular piece of armor that comes down from this satellite, and Tony Stark basically specifically designed it to be able to get shipped anywhere on Earth in almost an instant, so that he could have it on hand in case the Hulk went nuts. And so Tony Stark, through a series of fights, is able to finally knock the Hulk unconscious, barely, um, and so they can take him back. But the problem is that because of this rampage, the Avengers are essentially wanted. They got to lie low somewhere for a while, and so Clint Barton, or Hawkeye, knows of a safe house. And this is when we actually get like, because this is a point where the Avengers are kind of fractured. They don't trust each other. They definitely don't trust Stark. Um, but they're having some internal issues, and they need to kind of work those things out before they go back and they fight Ultron. And at the same time, Ultron is gathering materials, including the stone from Loki's scepter, and a minor character in the movie, Dr. Helen Cho, who's essentially a synthetic tissues expert, and using the vibranium that they got from the Wakandans to make Ultron's perfect body, or what he believes to be his perfect body. Um, so the Avengers, they're doing that while the Avengers go off to this safe house, which turns out to be a farm that Hawkeye has, that also has his family. And again, this is where we kind of get the redemption for Hawkeye from the first Avengers, where his character development was essentially pushed to the back for the majority of that movie. But now it's been brought back to the forefront, and he actually gets more character development in this movie than a lot of the major characters do, even though he is a major character. You know the point I'm trying to make. But he this is kind of the interesting thing, is that it shows that he's a family man. He has a daughter, a son, and another son on the way. And this also sets up again, because apparently his family gets dusted in Infinity War after the snap. So this is kind of his retirement plan, essentially, when he's done with the Avengers, and when he was done with Shield, and whenever he's done with the Avengers. And Nick Fury apparently helps set it up for him. But now we have the interactions between characters. You have Natasha really interacting with the Hulk, and you kind of learn a bit about each of their pasts. There was a line that I remember was controversial at the time, where Natasha calls herself a monster because she can't have children biologically, because that part of her was removed because it was deemed to be unnecessary during her assassin training in Russia. And it's really more a line that it's meant to emphasize that she thinks of herself as a monster for allowing it to happen. They took away basically the thing that, one of the major things that makes her a woman, the ability to bear a child. And Banner's whole excuse of why they can't be together is, basically the Hulk, and also because he can't have children because he's essentially been sterilized by the gamma radiation. Or he believes himself to be sterilized. Um, but it's a weird kind of relationship. Again, it's not developed very well. I take points off for that in this film, because this was something that I feels like it was Whedon's thing. He wanted it to kind of get developed a little bit in Avengers, which you can kind of see it somewhat, and then he wanted to carry it over into this movie. But because they used her so heavily in Winter Soldier, and they implied this relationship with Steve Rogers, even though there's lines contradicting it, they do heavily imply it from the physical and the body language. Um, it doesn't really it doesn't really mesh that well, and it doesn't really feel necessarily as a believable, as well, I shouldn't say believable, but they don't sell it as well as I think they could have, if they had played down that relationship in Winter Soldier more so, rather than not being a romantic relationship. Uh, and again, they don't explicitly say that it is in Winter Soldier, but it from the body language and everything else, it feels like it is. It feels like that's something, a lot more than what it felt like in Avengers when she, met the Hulk and Bruce Banner and stuff. Um, but they play that up here, and there's a whole thing where, like, oh, we can just run off together, and yada yada. Which again, I find that kind of stupid, because a massive death bot and his army are going to destroy the world. But you get a really good scene between Tony Stark and Captain America, and that scene is, again, this is further causing a rift between Cap and Iron Man, with the idea that they are two separate sides to the coin. In other words, Tony Stark wants to preemptively stop things, and Captain America, again, he's already seen what that looks like because of Winter Soldier, and he's trying to explain to Tony that they have to work as a team, and they can stop it, and they can stop what's going to happen. And Tony is almost assured that they're going to lose, but it's kind of an interesting back and forth, where Captain America and Tony Stark have two. They want the same thing, but they have two totally different ways of going about it. And this is diffused by Hawkeye's wife asking Tony to go into the family barn and fix the tractor. And this is a ploy because Nick Fury has shown up at the farm, probably contacted by Clint, and he basically talks to Tony and essentially almost inspires him to go back out there and stop Ultron. So they devise a plan because they realize that Ultron is making a body. So Captain America, uh, Hawkeye, and Black Widow go to try and stop. They are able to steal Ultron's perfect body while it's being transported, and because of that, they bring it back. But now they have a problem where now they have something that Ultron wants, but they need to make sure that he doesn't get it. But Stark has another idea, and he does this without the team's knowledge, where he decides to put Jarvis, who is apparently escaped to the internet. And was able to be salvaged. So Tony Stark essentially rebuilt Jarvis, who's a more powerful AI, and they're going to put him into Ultron's perfect body. At the same time, Thor has kind of gone off. When they reached the farm, Thor kind of went off, and this was the scene that Joss Whedon had such a problem with because it's supposed to be a lead into Infinity War, where he has a vision of the Infinity Stones in this little like cave somewhere, and he comes back and basically, while they're all fighting to try and stop what Tony Stark is doing, Thor smashes his hammer down and stops it, but he provides enough power to finish the process. So then Vision, who was the character that will become Vision, awakens from the chamber, and it's a very interesting scene where he kind of flies out, and I think if I remember correctly, Thor hits him with his hammer, and he flies out, and he's kind of just floating in air. They don't really explain how he can fly, but he's kind of just floating in midair, and he. Oh, sorry. I skipped over this. Natasha is also captured when they're stealing the body. She is captured by Ultron, which again I think was a strategic choice by them because Scarlett Johansson was pregnant during the filming of this movie. So it's probably that's why her action was downplayed a decent amount. But going back to the main story, Ultron is not Ultron. Vision is out by the window of Avengers Tower, and he sees New York City, and he sees everything for the first time. It's kind of weird. It's like a kid kind of examining the world for the first time. He's just kind of examining everything and looking at all the things that are around him, and just kind of trying to understand it. And he begins talking to the Avengers, where they're not sure if they should destroy him at this point because they don't know if he's a threat. And he basically, through a series of speeches, he identifies that Ultron's view of humanity as imperfect and dangerous to themselves is correct, but that doesn't mean that they should be exterminated. And so we have this great moment where he picks up Thor's hammer, which is on the ground from when he got hit by it, and gives it to Thor, but he's able to lift the hammer without any issues. And Thor, this is a great moment where Thor just looks at Stark and says, "Good job," and then just walks off. And it's one of the funnier moments. Again, it has kind of that Whedonism with the it's kind of that Whedonism type of humor. But it really, really does work, and I actually like Paul Bettany getting a bigger role in the MCU because really he had just been that voice in the Iron Man movies. He said he hadn't even watched the Iron Man films that he was involved in, and when I believe he said that when he's recording the ADR, he's doing it in a studio by himself. He's not doing it with Robert Downey Jr. or anybody else that he's talking to. But now that the Avengers are whole and they have all their new members, they're going to go to Sokovia because they've been able to track Ultron back to the old Hydra facility that they were in at the beginning of the film. And through this, they find out that Ultron is planning on basically levitating the city up into the sky, or a large portion of it up into the sky, and dropping it back down onto Earth in order to cause a cataclysmic event that will wipe out humanity. Um, Now this is it's the plan itself I find kind of goofy personally, but it's a comic book movie. I can live with it. It's not as clear cut as the first Avengers or even the third one. It's kind of convoluted, but it does make sense in a way. So, they go to Sokovia, and there's a whole basically they set up the final battle, which the final battle is actually fairly it's fairly entertaining, but it's kind of just a rehash of the first Avengers where they're just fighting an army of Ultron robots instead. But it's Ultron robots now instead of Chitauri. That's the only difference. Um, but the whole point is that they have this device that if one of that's getting ready and it's prepped, so it's the device that causes the jets to go off uh, on the little the piece of land that Ultron has levitated up into the sky now. Um, so the whole all of the battle leading up to it is kind of leading up to that showdown where they have to keep the Ultron robots away from this little jet that's going to be propelling stuff into the sky. Um, but again, it's kind of like the first. It's kind of a rehash of the first Avengers, and it doesn't work as well in this as it did in that. Where there's supposed to be this whole scene of this one big panning shot of everybody around this device, and if any of the Ultron bots touch it, then the city falls down, falls back to Earth, and everyone dies. Um, so the whole thing is they're supposed to be fighting off these drones while Nick Fury, who has shown up in the helicarrier, is evacuating citizens. And again, it's well shot. The action is well shot. There's a few really good scenes. There's a good scene between Hawkeye and Scarlet Witch right before this, where Hawkeye has this amazing line where he's trying to explain to her that she needs to step up and do what she has to do, and he's saying, we're on a floating city fighting robots, and I have a bow and arrow. None of this makes sense. And it's an amazing line. Again, it kind of reminds me a bit of the Tony Stark line, the genius billionaire playboy philanthropist line from the first Avengers. But again, this movie does a very good job at developing Hawkeye. I will give it that more than anything else. Um, but the last battle shows, Ultron versus Vision and Thor, and the last part of it, they managed to get everyone off the city, and then Iron Man and Thor managed to jumpstart the machine enough so that and destroy the piece of the city that's above everything, so that it doesn't come down and destroy the planet or destroy a majority of the planet. And Vision is able to essentially lock Ultron inside of his own individual body so that he can't escape to the internet and just start all this crap all over again. And at the end, we see that Vision confronts Ultron, where Ultron, he's like he doesn't understand why Vision is doing this. Vision knows that he's right, and Vision basically says, "Yes, I do know that, but I was born yesterday." And it's another great line out of that movie. The dialogue in for the most part in the movie is actually fairly good. I fault it more for the story elements, some of the story elements, and some of the rehashing of the first Avengers film. Um, so Ultron is then destroyed. The last Ultron is then destroyed by Vision, and the threat is essentially stopped. But because of all the issues that Ultron caused, the Avengers have chosen to move their facility into upstate New York. So they have a new uh, actual almost like military like facility in upstate New York that Stark had funded. Hulk has taken the Quinjet and gone off, and we find out later that he went off into space and went to War World, which we see in Thor Ragnarok. But we don't see Hulk for a while. Thor goes back to Asgard because now he has to try and track down what's happening with the other Infinity Stones. Tony Stark is going to go back to Stark Tower and do his thing. And Captain America and Black Widow are going to stay there and train the newer Avengers. And there's a lot. The last scene is, they walk into a room, and they're going to train. They have the new batch of Avengers, which is Scarlet Witch, Vision, uh, War Machine, and Falcon. So they're going to start, training those guys to be their new team. Now that Iron Man and a lot of the core members have kind of stepped down, and Hawkeye has retired to his farm. And apparently, Whedon actually wanted to include Spider-Man, I guess, in that as well, but they didn't have the rights to him quite yet at the time. They were still working out that deal that would eventually get him into Captain America: Civil War. So they didn't want to put him in there at that time, but that would have been kind of interesting if they did do that. And that's the way the movie ends. And then a post-credit scene has Thanos again getting his Infinity Gauntlet and saying he's going to go get the stones himself. Um, so, ultimately, the second Avengers movie, it does some things right, and it does advance characters that were not advanced previously. Again, like Hawkeye, you introduce characters that would become much deeper in the future, like Vision and Scarlet Witch. Quicksilver, by the way, also was killed in the battle on Sokovia, where he shields Hawkeye from getting shot a bunch of times, and he's killed in the process. So you also have one of the first major hero deaths in the MCU, even though he was which again I find that was kind of a waste in the sense of you just introduced him, you literally just introduced him, and you don't have any other speedster characters in the MCU really, right? At least not to the extent that Quicksilver is. So it's kind of crappy to kind of kill him off because there's a lot of potential there. But they did it. They killed him off, and it does ultimately let you focus a bit more on Wanda's character, which her powers are a bit more interesting. But you know, this movie does have problems. It's not an outrageously great film. I wouldn't put it on the same level as the first Avengers. I would definitely not put it on the same level as the third Avengers. And this, I think, due to that and due to some of the negative PR stuff that was surrounding it, specifically from Whedon, he was not asked to come back for Avengers 3, and he was cut loose by the MCU. So, ultimately, the movie itself is good. I don't think it's a bad film, but it does have problems. And I think at this point, the movie itself was riding on the MCU. It was riding on that popularity that it got from the films that preceded it. Especially, this was right after Captain America: The Winter Soldier, which is one of the best films that the MCU had put out to that point. So there was a lot there. But if I was to give this a ranking, and if I'm going to give it a rating, I will give it 5.4 Hulk sucker punches
With the benefit of hindsight,
out of 10. And with that, we are through most of Phase 2. We have one more film left, which is 2015's Ant-Man, starring Paul Rudd and Evangeline Lilly and Michael Douglas. So, with that, I think we are done with this one, and we will be moving on to part 13 uh, probably tomorrow, I'd say. Probably tomorrow. So, thank you again for listening. Remember, if you have any thoughts, leave them in the comment section. Uh, like the video, hit the bell for notifications, subscribe, and remember, I live my life free of compromise. Do you?